Great. Okay. Well, thank you all again for being here. I know I'm really excited for this session. I think in a conference focused on education systems and systems change, this topic of long-term trajectories of change is a really critical one to dig into, because I think this is kind of at the heart of what we're trying to achieve. And so I think at this point we know a lot, and we've heard a lot, in the last couple of days about the what works to improve learning outcomes. And I think that leaves us with two big pressing questions in the global education space, one of which is the how to get it done, which is the implementation components that we've heard a lot about. And we had the panel last night that dug into that a little bit. And the other is how to get it to last, right? And so when I define that latter one, I would define as achieving this kind of deep transformational change that takes a low-performing education system and turns it into one that's sustainably achieving high and strong outcomes for the students in it. And we have 4 papers in this session that are going to speak to that topic from different angles. And they're in roughly 2 groupings. So the first 2 papers look at the role of political commitment to change. And the shape that that's taken in different contexts and time periods, as well as which I think is really important and even came out of it yesterday, how that kind of commitment to change has been enabled and supported in different contexts as well. So the first paper in that grouping is going to be one by Debbie and Luis, which takes this phrase, long-term trajectories, the most literal of all the papers in my session. They do this great historical overview looking at how Korea and Japan emerged from being relatively low-performing to being quite high-performing over the period of about 50 to 100 plus years. And so we're going to hear a lot about what drove that change, and they extract lessons on the role of this deep national commitment to education in both of those transformation periods and experiences. And then we'll hear from Pattillo, who picks up this theme of political commitment and looks at why coalitions and political commitment emerge in different contexts and in some places and not others. And I think hers does a nice job of bringing some of these concepts from Debbie and Luis's paper into a present day global South context. And then we'll hear 2 more papers in this second set that look at more specific reform efforts and drawing out lessons from Ethiopia and South Africa. So we'll hear from Mesele Araya, who's going to present on a period of reforms in Ethiopia, which produced somewhat paradoxical outcomes, which are quite interesting to dig into. And I also think this paper does a nice job of showing how difficult it can be to disentangle and explain outcomes in a complex policy environment. And I don't know that I've ever found a policy environment that's not complex. So I think that's helpful for thinking through how we should be thinking about disentangling these different drivers. And then finally, we'll hear from Stephen, who's going to present on a structured pedagogy program in South Africa that tracked individual students' long-term learning trajectories, and I think provides really important new evidence on spillovers and the impact of foundational learning for later educational outcomes, both in the schooling and the learning front. So with that, I will hand it over to Debbie to kick us off. Thanks.
Thank you, Michelle. So as she mentioned, today I'm talking about a comparative education history that Luis Crouch and I have spent the last year and a half working on, as brought in by RISE and supported by RTI. And we're exploring its relevance to educational development today. So rather than zooming in into specifics about what Japan and Korea did and how to apply that elsewhere, we're actually going to take some meta lessons of specifically the why and the how of how each country experienced really, really remarkable education transformations. The why in each case was a deeply felt national purpose and a very clearly articulated role of education for national development and national unity. The how was proactive and nuanced policy borrowing and adaptation that was incredibly proactive, particularly for that era. So quick overview, why Japan and Korea? We're looking at Japan, 1880 to 1930, Korea, roughly 1945 to 1985, although some of the period that we're talking about actually starts in the later 19th century. In the 1945 later period, we're talking here about South Korea. So they're both massive success stories that are non-Western. Massive catch-up transformation, going from a low level of literacy relatively to high in about 40 years. Today, they consistently top the international league tables. And what doesn't get emphasized enough is that their success has been remarkably equal. There's tremendous within-country equality, both in achievement on international assessments, as well as years of education. And this work has been very intentional and very purposive, rather than a longer-term sort of evolutionary change, as is seen in other Western countries. So they're borrowing and considering, as well as rejecting other ideas very explicitly. A quick check-in on where they are now. Japan and Korea, on average, in TIMSS for 2015 in grade 4 maths, their average was 2 standard deviations above developing countries, and quite above that of Netherlands and Finland as well. Very importantly, using an inequality measure, they've got half the inequality of developing countries. So sort of low average performers in each of these countries are still performing incredibly well. And I think that's something that we're all sort of seeking to aspire to. So the purpose here, the why on this, was a very unique sort of response to external threats. Japan had emerged from self-imposed isolation during the Tokugawa era. Korea had a similar period of that. And those were really sort of military-backed forced openings that took place in both countries. In Japan, it was Matthew Perry's expedition in 1851 and 53, pardon me. In Korea, it was 1871. And there was a sort of a forced opening of each of these countries or societies at that point to Western commercial interests. So the responses were intensely nationalistic. They were modernizing, and they weren't really a rejection of the West, but a recognition of the importance of this commensurate, again, quote, modernization along adapted, contested, and negotiated lines of education policy. So specifically, Japan's concerns were military technology, which required a specific kind of industrialization, which required a certain kind of education. So part of our argument here that I'll get to later is a mild version of this actually occurred in post-colonial Africa as well, but it got highly diluted for some various reasons that I'll get to in a minute. So the purpose here, again, this why, this education was a critical role for this emerging national identity. And education was defined very explicitly as very equal provision. That education just for elites wasn't going to cut it and wasn't at all in line with this vision. So they took a lot of care to distinguish national, and in the paper, which is itself 162 pages, we take care to distinguish national purpose for education and national unity from sort of a coarse education for nationalism that we see in Germany and in fact Japan prior to and during World War II. So here we're talking about national purpose versus nationalism. We go pretty deep into this distinction, and I'm going to gloss over it just a little bit here because of time. So the language in the foundational documents was incredibly beautiful. It was poetic. We don't see that in education documents now. We don't see that level of sort of moving emotion. And it was really appreciated. Education was appreciated not as a proxy or as a lever to improve economic outcomes or health outcomes, but really as its own goal. So that deep ownership was a manifestation of that deep owned purpose. I want to note that there wasn't any external donor influence in Korea or Japan prior to World War II. And there was a really deep questioning of policies that were borrowed in both cases. Japan, that came from journals, it came from education associations, the Korean Educational Development Institute, as well as some very interesting relationship with a contingent from Florida State University took place in Korea. It really, that deep ownership has become sort of a buzzword over the past decade or longer, not because it's sort of good development practice, but in these cases, it was really arising from this very, very deep purpose. So getting into the how, both countries undertook really, really interesting policy borrowing missions. And just for the sake of time, I'm going to go a little more deeply into the Iwakura mission. In addition to the United States, they visited Australia, Belgium, Denmark, France, Germany, Italy, Netherlands, Russia, Sweden, and Switzerland. I did have to write that down. And a full half of the high-ranking officials from the new Meiji government went on this. So imagine being so committed to educational development that you send fully half of your high-ranking officials on an international trip for 2 years to learn about what's going on from other educational countries. This is the level of commitment that I'm speaking of here. And this 107-member delegation, their experience was quite heterogeneous. So their impressions were very heterogeneous. And this shaped subsequent education reforms for decades. Those who went on this mission continued working in government for decades, and their perspectives and what they saw and how they interpreted it continue to shape subsequent reforms for quite some time. And they weren't uncritical observers either. They were very unimpressed with primary provision in Europe and France and Russia, quite particularly working class education provision in England. They saw that as likely to really reproduce the kinds of social inequalities that the Japanese delegation wanted to leave behind via these education reforms. So there's a really solid history here of proactive, nuanced policy borrowing. And that meant that once donors got into the game post-World War II, there was an institutional memory of really careful consideration and contextualization and adaptation of any proposed policies. And so there's not really losing sight of national identity and purpose, even after the horrors of Japanese nationalistic education in the first half of the 20th century. As they emerged from that era, there was still a very strong national purpose that was quite revised, but unity and purpose was part of education even after that era. So I want to dive really quickly into developing countries, which is way too large a topic to sort of dive into here, but we use in the paper Ghana, Tanzania, South Africa, and Zimbabwe as proxies. So the early speeches of Pan-African leaders were really beautiful. They were full of purpose for education as a driver for national unity and national identity. But there was really a disconnect between the bureaucracy, with the bureaucracy and the laws. So white papers from this era really don't reflect that same level of purpose that you read from Pan-African leaders' speeches. And the introduction of education planning documents, which were typically co-authored by UNESCO during this era, were rife with, refer to education's role in both social and economic development, but subsequent plans really focused exclusively on educational development. National level education system blueprints really kind of served to fulfill these human capital needs of manpower surveys and sort of lost some of this sort of higher purpose. And there are a few reasons for that. There's strong influence of manpower surveys for social development goals during that time. There was lack of commensurate surveys for the more social development goals, and a genuine need, frankly, for economic growth to fund all this education that they're looking at. I'm writing a paper we're breaking this into a smaller paper right now, and I've been working on this bit. I'd love to talk to you if you've got more thoughts on this afterwards. So through this, we came up with a policy borrowing framework to compare the why and the how of Japan and Korea's education transformations to countries like Ghana, Tanzania, South Africa, and Zimbabwe. We put together a series of questions, sort of a framework, to analyze a country's engagement with purpose and whether policies are borrowed in a manner that remains true to that purpose. So how do you tell when purpose is being engaged? Who is engaged in defining the direction of the education sector? What's their position in society? Moral leadership, technical reputation, what's their power to truly make it happen? Now, what does the process of policy borrowing look like? Oop, apologies. When policies and ideas are borrowed, are they worked over, tested? Are they contested? And are they for delivering results in similar environments at a reasonable cost, with cultural fit? How much energy is put into incrementally observing practice from the ground up through natural variation, and then sort of codify that into a ministry policy? Or the policies and practices being considered based on 2 or 3 gold standard RCTs? How truly networked and ongoing are the networks and social groups that are defining these kinds of things? And where is the energy and the drive for engagement coming from? Is it the donors who are calling the meetings, really vetting the ideas and deciding whether they're on plan or not? Are they writing out the research agenda? How? So whether the process about whether actors can do is more important than sort of the specifics of institutional arrangements, at first at least. You know, are the discussions focusing on imitating form for the sake of appearance? Do we have to have an emis because that's how we look like we're doing the rational thing? Or does it focus more meaningfully on how to relate to action to results, and whether that kind of relating can be done in practice on the ground by frontline education actors? So the borrowing framework engages with substantive issues. Are these policies being borrowed from the right place? Are the countries that they were borrowing from in fact successful according to whatever metrics you're imagining or are important? And do we know that those policies are actually what's related to that success and it's not third factors? How tied are the policies being borrowed to the historical sociology and politics of the originating country? The United States has unsuccessfully tried to export its land grant university program for decades now, despite that being really rooted in the United States independent 19th century family farm system. So is the borrowing motivation deeply in line with education system improvement goals? Or is it more superficial? Is it to be seen to be in fashion? Is it to meet bureaucratic checklists? Or maybe an electoral policy promise that isn't really truly felt across the populace? And how much questioning and adaptation can be done or has been done? Have the constraints to implementation been analyzed by the implementers themselves? Is the adaptation process as well can be a way to sort of sell these ideas internally, build support for and buy-in for them, as opposed to catching implementers, particularly teachers, off guard with new policies. And then there's some marketing issues as well. So whose impulse drove the borrowing? Was it donors? Was it teachers? Was it educators? What is the policy lender's agenda? You know, not to single out Finland, but there is absolutely a bit of a cottage industry in exporting what Finland has done to other countries. So is there a reputation on the line? Is there consulting fees on the line? So you've got a minute left, and I'm going to fly through these lessons. I would love to talk to if there are questions at the end about this. So what are the lessons that we can apply? An education system's purpose must be agreed and really felt at the outset. There's no way to borrow policies without contesting it through adaptation and iteration. And the means are important. You notice I didn't talk at all about what Japan and Korea actually did. We're talking about how they were borrowed. And once you're borrowing means, you understand sort of how to fit them into the purpose and whether they fit the purpose or not. And numerical indicators are of course important and they're useful, but shouldn't be confused with purpose. If you've got any questions, follow up here and look forward to the questions. Thank you so much.
Good morning, everybody. While we're waiting for the slides, I just want to wake everybody up a bit because I'm a teacher at heart. So what I'm going to do is say, if I call out what you are, you're going to stand up. So stand up if you are a professor at a university. Stand up if you work at a think tank or a research organization. We have a lot of those. Stand up if you're a PhD student in progress or a postdoc. Those are the people who might be on the job market, so look out for them. Stand up if you work for a government. I know we have at least one here. Oh, we've got two. Yeah, they're about to present. And did I miss? Oh, stand up if you're a funder. I know you might not want to identify yourself, but you've got to do it. I know there's a few of you in the room. Those are the ones you need to go chat with if you have an organization. And stand up if you're an implementer, like a NGO or a nonprofit or a company doing work. Awesome. There's a lot of those too. If I missed you, stand up. So that's everybody. Great. Okay. So today I'm going to talk about what enables hubs and political will and coalitions for education reform, specifically using examples from India and Brazil. And first, I want to take you to Nairobi in 2016 when I moved there. So this was a really exciting time. We had Shofco and Bridge Innovative Schools both launched a decade earlier in 2008. We had the Uwezo study and Armando's here coming out telling us that learning outcomes weren't changing. We had the Tusome reforms coming in government. And we had the fiber optic cables being laid to Kenya, which brought M-Pesa and other waves of tech innovation and enabled a lot of ed tech to come, like Ineza education. And then we also had coming the government's competency-based education reforms. Alongside that, we had later in the Human Capital Index that Kenya was ranked first out of all African countries, tied with Algeria, putting aside 2 African islands. And so Kenya was really, at this time, and still is in many ways, Africa's hub for education, innovation, and reform. And I was lucky enough to be part of it. And this got me thinking about, why does this happen? So why do certain places at certain times become hubs for innovation in certain topics? And so you'll see this happens for many different topics throughout history. So places like Athens or Paris or Silicon Valley, places at certain times actually become hubs that enable innovation on certain topics. And so I became really interested in, why does this happen specifically for education? And so when I came to do my master's at Oxford, decided to focus on these 2 questions. So why does this happen specifically for education reforms and innovation in global South contexts? And specifically when coalitions emerge for education reform in those contexts, what forms do they take? And so this was a master's thesis, which involved 2 main pieces. I did a survey of shadow cases across 106 countries to sort of identify where was more innovation reforms happening. And then I dived into 2 case studies from India and Brazil. And this mainly builds on literature and political sociology. I also, after doing this study, spent 3 months in Brazil and a month and a half in India as research. I'm turning this into a book about 7 principles to transform education systems. And with the survey, I was really looking for 3 things. So innovations led by nonprofits and companies, where was there more political will and government reforms, and where were there coalitions, which I define as a group of actors all working towards a shared goal related to education reform. And we'll see that this is pretty obvious. Most places are not hubs. So these are just some examples on this slide, but essentially for very obvious reasons, in places where there's more war and conflict, or they have issues like political crises, or they're predominantly rural, there's just not as much education, innovation, and reform happening. And so you might have cases where in a rural country, the government is leading a specific reform, or a place where, in a context where there's war, there's organizations working to do education in those contexts, but there's typically not as many because they're much more challenging environments to work in and harder to set up in. But what we do see is that there are at least 20 hubs in Global South context. So this is just a really surface level dive. I really hope someone could do a much deeper analysis than I did of where in the Global South are hotspots. But these are the ones that I identified. And you'll recognize a lot of these from the RISE research, from the work that Jonathan London has done on Vietnam, for example. But I can send you these slides if you're interested. I'm going to go through these pretty fast. But these are places like Sierra Leone, where David Sengay has been leading a lot of really interesting reforms, like Punjab province in Pakistan, Ecuador, Luminos, who I think is here doing work in Ethiopia, South Africa's Data-Driven Districts Initiative, Mesele in Peru. These are some of the examples of the hubs that exist. And then diving into 2 specific cases of hubs in Delhi and Sao Paulo, I chose these because they're very similar in many ways, but they also have a couple key differences. So these are both huge cities, some of the biggest cities in the world, in some of the world's largest countries. And they have these examples of coalitions, but they're pretty different in the sense that in Brazil, the Movimento Pela Base coalition was led and initiated by philanthropy, by Lehman Foundation, who's here. You can talk to Daniel and Laura more about this. And it was an example of where there wasn't as much political will around an issue at the beginning, but this coalition was able to build that political will over many years in a very challenging context. And in contrast, in Delhi, Aadmi Party is an example where a political party started and decided they had the political will to prioritize education, and they gathered a coalition of NGOs and technical experts to design and deliver a set of reform efforts in also very challenging context. So Aadmi Party was a new party coming out of an anti-corruption campaign, and they won in a very sort of upset election in 2015. They won power over the Delhi Municipal Assembly, which oversees the Delhi Union Territory. And began doing a very rapid process of reform. And you can read the amazing book that Rise put out by Yamini Ayar and others that's about a specific program that was part of the reforms. And these are some of the partners that were involved in various ways. And this impacts over 1.8 million students who are in Delhi's school system. They had the Dalai Lama launch a happiness curriculum. On the top right is Manish Sisodia, who was the former deputy minister, doing a school visit. On the left, the New York Times featured them in a front page article. And on the right, you can see how the party actually uses this narrative of what they call the Delhi education revolution as a marketing tool, essentially. And they really picked education and used it as a way to build their brand to voters. And in contrast, in Brazil, Lehman Foundation essentially decided that they wanted to pick a specific policy that they wanted to influence that would shift Brazil's education system. And after looking at a lot of examples around the world, including the US Common Core, they decided national learning standards were going to be the issue that they would focus on. And so they decided to start this coalition that ended up including over 65 leaders from across government, civil society, academia, and they successfully, over many years, influenced the adoption of a national learning standards curriculum policy. And there's great work by Lehman Foundation about this online. On the right is a snapshot from one of the MPB meetings in progress. On the left is just an example of how education can be very politicized in Brazil. And there were a lot of protests actually against the policy that they were advocating for. It was very contentious in many ways. And what we learned, so there's kind of two pieces to this, and the first piece is about these 13 factors. And what we see is that on the left, there's a lot that's outside of any one actor's control in order to enable these kinds of hubs and political will and coalitions to occur. And on the right, there actually are a lot of things that we as people in this room and actors can do to enable this to be more likely to happen. And so one example is actually just having a city. So there's a lot of literature about how urbanization enables more transfer and flow of ideas and innovations. There's also research about how it accelerates activist networks and social movements and revolutions, but essentially having a bigger city is better for the purposes of innovation. And that's not really anything one person can enable to happen, urbanization in certain places. Also, having more money in a place can help. It doesn't necessarily help because you could have a lot of wealthy people who don't really care about education, but in some cases, if they decide to take this step, it could be really helpful. And so in India and Brazil, you had Ashish Dhawan, who was in private equity and decided to start Central Square Foundation. And in Brazil, you had Jorge Paulo Lemann, who started Lehman Foundation. And both of these individuals were really influential, and their foundations were in creating enabling ecosystems in their context, obviously alongside the huge teams that they built to do so. One other factor, which is a little trickier to talk about, is about how certain places just have more of a history of collective action. And I argue that this actually can be really useful. And so, for example, in Brazil, you have this history of this practice called mutirão, which is basically villages coming together to build barns or do other shared activities together. In India, you have these concepts of seva and samaj, of service. And in both contexts, you have lots of social movements for various causes that have existed. And so on the left, you'll see Paulo Freire, who led literacy campaigns in Brazil. On the right, you see Gandhi and the non-independence movement, and the independence movement, sorry. And in Brazil, you have a specific legacy of their structure of the government being coalitional presidentialism. So they have this history of coalitions in government that was really helpful for coalitions to emerge. You also have things that just happen by surprise that no one really can control. So, for example, in Brazil, during this coalition, you had the impeachment of President Dilma Rousseff, which created a huge challenge for the coalition. You also had the election of Bolsonaro, who was really anti-education policies in many ways. And in the Delhi case, you had the head of the reforms, Manish Sisodia, was arrested. So I spent 2 weeks shadowing him in February, and a week after I said goodbye, he was arrested, and he's still currently in jail as we speak, which obviously caused a huge challenge for the reform process. And in both cases, these political events really shaped the rollout and created, sometimes it was easier for them to move forward and sometimes it was more difficult. And particularly in India, the climate around the central government and the BJP trying to crack down on journalists and opposition parties has created a real problem for AAP, who is an opposition party. What's also key is just having talent and leaders to actually work and lead reforms. And so in both cases in Brazil, you have the Layman Fellowship on the left, the right side of the left photo is a Layman Fellow who's been key in government in Brazil. And on the right side, you have a Teach for India Fellow who leads a nonprofit that's been a key partner in the AAP reforms. But why is this important? Because people really do matter. And so if you have leaders who are committed to leading change and who have political will, they can make the difference. And in both cases, it was just 3 leaders who actually initiated these reform and coalition processes. Obviously, a lot of other factors and people were necessary for them to succeed, but it really was the actions of 3 leaders. And if we invest in these networks of leaders and emergence of will amongst those networks, that really can matter. Also, seeding organizations who can actually implement. So on the left is examples of Layman Foundation's portfolio. They've invested in over 100 organizations. On the right is part of Central Square Foundation's theory of change. Both funders really single-handedly helped accelerate there to be a lot of talent in organizations testing innovations in each of their ecosystems, which enabled both of these coalitions. We also see the role of data. You're familiar with the story of POW. Shout out to Armando again, because Acer was really key in the India case. And so Sisodia talks about how when he was a journalist, he covered the Acer results. And this was part of what made him decide to care about education and part of why he convinced Aam Aadmi Party to focus on education as an issue. You can also think about training and spreading activist skills very intentionally. So this is Dinis Misne, who's now head of Layman Foundation. In his time before, when he led Sue de Paz and was an activist on gun control issues, and during that time, he learned a lot about what makes advocacy work well and what doesn't. And he was trained by a foundation on how to do participatory strategic planning, which he says was very key in shaping his understanding of advocacy. And then when he became head of Layman Foundation, that was part of the skill set he brought. Also having exposure to progressive education models. So Atishi, a leader who's been key in the movement, actually taught at an innovative school that was started by an educationist, Krishnamurti, which shaped her experience and commitment to education later on as a politician. We also have cross-border sharing. I'm totally going to steal Debbie's term of the policy borrowing. I need to get that right, but this is essentially a similar example where both of these coalitions visited other places and decided to take models from Finland, US, and other places. And also on these trips, they weren't just about knowledge sharing, they were also about trust and really building solidarity amongst movement members, which theory shows is very key for coalitions to succeed. They also, in both cases, have organizations that are specifically tasked with orchestrating the coalition. So you have MPB in Brazil. In India, you have the government itself, but also supporting actors like the NGO Education Alliance that are specifically trying to help coordinate all these different pieces that are necessary in a coalition. And they also have, both of them, this piece about co-creation and policy design. And in the Brazil example, they had a lot of forums with states, municipalities, and Sisodia specifically often invited teachers and principals to his house to get their input on policies, like in this photo. What we see is that you essentially need enabling factors for a place, you need people to actually lead a coalition, and then coalitions can take at least 2 forms. I'm sure there's many more, and I'm just gonna whip through some of these examples. So I have, I'll send you the slides if you want to read specifically more about all the steps, but essentially we have one that I call the strike scenario, which is where a coalition can happen very fast because essentially politicians decide to do it. And so this is things like having a commitment to actually prioritize education. You'll see the head of CSF speaking about how AAP did that here. You have all these different technical support that they brought in, and all of these have a lot more detail in the actual thesis if you want to read it. It's things like co-design, it's having trust to overcome the bureaucracy and all the different resistance that they faced in the Delhi case. And then you also just have to have luck, like the fact that AAP was able to suddenly win power in the time that they did. And then they also face challenges like the arrest. Or the second channel is what I call the slow build process. So this is essentially, you have a coalition that builds that political will over a long period of time. For MPB, it took them 5 years from inception of when they first started talking about this to when they actually got the policy adopted. And it's been many more years after that of trying to support the implementation process. So it can take a very long time. And this involves factors like the Lehman Foundation itself actually deciding to take on advocacy and Dennis's commitment to that. It's things like Julia, who actually did the MPP here, talking about how they were able to bring together people from different political parties who didn't even want to sit at the same table, or one of them didn't even want to board the plane. Other factors here, and yeah. Okay, then we'll be done. Great. Email me if you want to talk more about it. Thank you so much.
Thank you for the first two presenters for explaining how education reform is a complex and highly politicized task that simplifies my work. And speak a bit on education reform and learning outcomes in Ethiopia, and a joint work with Hoddinott and colleagues at the Eryilmaz Center. So to give you background, the Ethiopian education has been very dynamic over recent years with a number of interventions with respect to quality of improvement or quality of education reform. And under 3 phases, we have this GQ program, which is a general education program improvement, and started 2008 under 3 phases, especially the first phase were more of on input focus, especially in terms of constructing schools in remote areas, as well as school supplies like textbooks. And then in the second phase, we have more of a process to supplement, to complement this school enrollment with some school improvement like teacher training centers or something like this. And then in the third phase, we have equity focus reform, focusing on girls, students with disabilities, and students in nomadic areas. So this is the complex system we have. And then if you see on the theory of change, because the reform has about 6 components, but we'll focus on the second component, the teacher development program, and how this has been impacting learning outcomes of students. Basically, the channels are just straightforward and simple. If you have some pre-service teacher training, in-service teacher training, licensing activities, then it will lead to improved content knowledge, pedagogical skills, as well as to learning outcomes of students. So with this, we have objectives like to examine how learning levels of grade 4 had changed between 2012 and 2018, and then how this improvement in teacher content knowledge is associated with learning outcomes or learning progress of students. And we'll also see some of the benefits who have been benefited from this system. Basically, we have 2 data. We are using 2 data here. It's not really an impact evaluation, it's just comparison and looking at some association of the reform using the Young Lives baseline collected as the start of the GQ program too, because here we are focusing on the second phase of the program instead of just all over the programs, because we do have different cohorts of students, but we'll just compare 2 cohorts for the purpose of this presentation. So in 2012, we have Young Lives, which is nested under the broader Young Lives study. And we collected data from 90 schools and 500 students with some tests twice in a year, and teacher content knowledge and full teacher and school surveys and some household data. Similarly, RISE has been very innovative to link its design with the Young Lives, and we just administer the same pattern of tests, and from about 168 schools and 3,000 plus students with the same test and teacher content knowledge structure and household data. The tests just were calibrated and linked with young lives using item response theory and with somehow 500 mean and 100 standard deviation. The item basically just item function well with acceptable item difficulties and discrimination indexes. We have some iteration, in fact, because we have been testing the student twice of a year at the beginning and the end. The young lives has about 14% of iteration and about 18% for the young lives. And we take consideration the iteration in the analysis. We just make a value-added model because just how student has achieved over the school year with standing or starting from the baseline. And we just run different separate regressions for the young lives and rise surveys as we cannot combine as the students are different cohorts. So, but we also just run conditional quantiles so that we'll be able to see the distribution who has been just benefited from the reform and check it for some iteration weights as well. And then overall, what we can see in the first instance is we found a declining average test score in the system. When you see some of the baseline and endline, obviously the learning level, the average test score has been lower for the rise cohort than the young lives. But I mean, this has to be seen in the context of rapid increase and quite unprecedented access in terms of enrollment. Because if we just triangulate or if we support this data with some of coming from the Ministry of Education within this period under the GQ2, about 3 million additional new students joined the primary school. In a sense, from about 16 million to 19 million students have been there within the Ethiopian primary education system. So there seems to be a change in the composition of students in the classroom, and which has to do with much of the decline and the average test score. I mean, if students are coming to the systems, particularly first generation learners, it's natural to see or a declining average test score. But on the other side, we find somehow improvement in teacher content knowledge as well as teacher qualification. In fact, the teacher qualification is an index of somehow experience, specialization in matters and teaching experiences. So we find relative 2012 teachers in 2018 had higher qualification in terms of degrees or specialization in matters, and above all, higher content knowledge. If you see the distribution, probably it's just the rise side, it's just to the left, to the right side, and then the young lives to the left side, which indicates that there has to be some improvement on the teacher content knowledge. So our purpose was to link the teacher content knowledge with the student learning progress. Obviously, the baseline is lower for the young lives, for rise than the young lives, but we are trying here the learning progress over the school year with somehow the end line. So if you see the simple correlation or association, obviously the teacher content knowledge has been just somehow insignificant, the young lives, but here in terms of the teacher content knowledge for the rise, it was just somehow significant, positively associated for both boys and girls. The same is true for the math teacher qualification, and obviously class size and others have been somehow negatively related for some reasons. And the same is true, we just disaggregate by household wealth. This indicates that students from the poorest have benefited from the system or teacher content knowledge. As you can see just at the top, it's about 12 scale points in terms of learning value or learning progress for the rise. And the same is true for rural. Students from rural have been benefited from just knowledgeable teacher in terms of mathematics for the RISE survey, and to see somehow the distribution who have been whether students at the bottom of the distribution have benefited from the teacher content knowledge. Obviously, that is our just findings that benefit increased as we go down or to the bottom of the quantile. So it's about 12 scale points, and then probably even the top are not benefiting. It's very difficult to justify, but probably if you can assume, I mean, probably strong students may not just need this much support from knowledgeable teacher or whatever the reason, but it's highly positive with the students at the bottom, or weaker students have been benefiting from the system, but we can't find this much strong association in the for the young lives study. We further disaggregate the schools to see some whether there would be some resampling issue. I mean, sampling issue. So we try to group the schools into 4 groups, because here we have young lives. We have common schools between RISE and young lives. So the group 1 are schools who have only data at the baseline 2012, and the group 2 schools are schools in both RISE and young lives, but who have data only for 2012. And group 3 are schools who are common in both surveys, but who have data only 2018. And obviously group 4 are only sampled in RISE. So we see the same pattern. I mean, if we see the common schools, we have the same structure with overall sample, which means that sampling may not have this much issue for this study. And we found that group 3 schools and group 4 have higher learning progress in relation to teacher content knowledge. Probably the conclusion is, obviously, average test score has been declining over time, and on the reverse, teacher content knowledge has improved, and it has been positively associated with learning outcomes, and the magnitude even increases over time because it has somehow positive relation with young lives, but the magnitude increases with the RISE ones. So the key to reconcile is probably the system has been working quite in multiple ways. In one, it has been changing the composition of the student body with who attend the school. And on the other side, it has been increasing the amount of learning which takes place within the classroom. That's just what I can say in terms of the seemingly paradox findings. But generally, what we can conclude is to improve learning. I mean, in such large education reform, it's very difficult to see the impact in a short time because it takes a long time and it needs somehow sustained commitment, engaging local actors, because there are just different actors within the education reform, as well as focusing on equity. Thank you very much.
Well, I can start by saying good morning, everyone. Great. And I can start by introducing my co-authors. So I'm Stephen Taylor from South Africa. I work in the Department of Basic Education, which is government department. And one of my co-authors works with me there, Nompumelelo Mohlwane, you might know her as Mbumi. And then other co-authors with us today is Yakweba Saliers and Matthew Jukes. And not with us today is Jonathan Stern and Bram Fleisch. And we are going to be presenting on the long run effects of an experiment we ran between 2015 and 2017 in South Africa. It was an early grade reading intervention. And we're looking here at the long run effects at year 7 or 4 years after the intervention was completed. The motivation for this research obviously is that I think foundational literacy and numeracy, by the way, has become a big development priority in recent years. I think groups such as this have been giving a lot of attention to it. We've moved away from just looking at access to school to the quality and especially to early learning as a foundation. Reading in particular, I think, is seen as a gateway to later learning and as a foundational skill that other learning builds on. We also know we have a big problem in this area in many countries, and in South Africa in particular, we have a big problem around it. The latest PIRLS results suggest that about 81% of South African children reach grade 4 without having reached an acceptable level of reading comprehension. So we know we have a challenge there, and that's why we increasingly regarding early learning interventions and early grade reading interventions as a potentially cost-effective way to intervene in the school system. But I think the ultimate cost effectiveness of those kinds of programs will depend on whether the impacts persist over time, on things like staying in school and your ultimate educational attainment, but also on later learning outcomes. And theoretically, there are various reasons to expect that there would be persistence and even compounding of benefits of having received a good early learning intervention. For instance, if reading is regarded as this gateway, then perhaps getting a solid reading intervention early on opens up opportunities to learn elsewhere, and the effects actually compound when you look at later learning. On the other hand, there are reasons to expect possible fade outs of impact, that maybe if the rest of your schooling is not of a high enough quality, or perhaps if the skills that are impacted in the foundational learning only partly translate into later skills, then you might expect some sort of a fade out over time. So it is to some extent an empirical question that I think not many studies have focused on yet. And also not many studies have actually looked at how specific early skills end up begetting later skills or leading to later skills. And we're trying to make a contribution to that. So the study design is that we're building on this initial randomized evaluation known as the early grade reading study. It was a structured learning program that targeted home language literacy in the northwest province of South Africa, where the home language is Setswana. And it provided teachers with a combination of lesson plans, of additional reading materials, and on-site coaching. It was done between 2015 and 2017, while the cohort of learners went from grade 1 to grade 3. The initial findings was that it led to a 0.24 standard deviation increase in home language literacy and reading, which was the primary targeted outcome of the program. We also, by the way, did find 1 year later after the program ended that there was a sustained impact on learning and also on teaching practice that had also, to some extent, had a sustained impact. And so the current study now builds on this by looking at the same cohort of children by 4 years after the intervention ended. So most children would be in grade 7, assuming they haven't repeated. However, we can just look at how progression actually turned out for the control group and the treatment group. Maybe starting right at the bottom, we see a slightly higher rate of school level attrition in the coaching group. That's schools that closed. So we regard that as totally random, that there just happened to be, I think, 3 or 4 schools that closed amongst the intervention group, and only 1 or 2, I think 1 school that closed in the control group. If we look at the top end, though, children who reached grade 7 without any delay, then we see a higher proportion of children who are in grade 7 in the treated group. So we do find some impact, and we also ran some regressions on this, some positive impact on progression, on grade progression, reaching grade 7. And that might turn out to be more important with time, because one of the risk factors for dropping out of school in secondary school is a kind of a delayed school trajectory. That like high rates of repetition tends to be a risk factor for dropping out of school because of being overaged. Just some brief differences in means before we look at the regression results. And this is partly being shown to show you the kinds of items that were assessed. So we had a range of home language items, which is Setswana is the language, starting with but this is by grade 7 now. So from the early grade reading assessment type of items, we still had oral reading fluency and some comprehension based on that oral reading fluency passage. But then we also included a written comprehension item, which was one of the released items from the PIRLS assessment. And we had that for home language in Setswana. And then we also had some English items, also the EGRA type stuff, but also a PIRLS item, a written comprehension item in English. And just casting your eye, you see sort of moderate impacts across most of these items, but what I want to focus on is this table, because this table restricts the sample to children who are assessed both at wave 4 and at wave 5. Because we want to look for the same sample, it's restricted to the same sample, and also the items that were common across time. So there's 3 main items here that were common across time. One was the oral reading fluency in home language, which is Setswana, columns 5 and 6. Then it was also the home language written comprehension, columns 7 and 8 there, and the English written comprehension, columns 9 and 10. And if we compare column 5 and 6, you might want to focus on the standard deviation effect scores on the bottom row. We see very, very similar impact sizes at grade 4 and grade 7. It's wave 4 and 5. Which translates in terms of words per minute to about 6 additional words per minute. For the Setswana written comprehension, we also see very, very similar effect sizes. So persistence, you might say, across those 2 common items for the same samples of children who we looked at both points in time. For English written comprehension, which was not the primary targeted outcome of the program, here we didn't see a big impact, statistically significant impact in wave 4, but by the time we get to wave 5 or grade 7, we now do start to see a statistically significant impact on English written comprehension. And so that points to a positive spillover effect into a second language, which becomes an important language for learning and teaching beyond the first 3 years of school in South Africa. And so it's suggesting that there is kind of an overall persistence of effects, but perhaps we start to see some spillover into emerging important skills later on. Next, I want to look at some quantile regressions to look at impacts across the distribution. And the first 2 here are for grade 2, so early on, initial impacts of the program. And if we look at letter sound recognition in Setswana, which is a very, maybe an early foundational skill, we see an overall impact across the distribution, but the impact is largest perhaps in the lower to mid range of the distribution. Whereas at the same point in time, if we looked at oral reading fluency, which is a slightly more advanced reading skill, words read correctly per minute from a paragraph, you see that the impacts were largest in the middle to upper range of the distribution. If we then look at it in grade 7, and something got a bit messed up in the translation to the screen, but that's fine. This is grade 7 quantile regressions. For oral reading fluency, now it's sort of a uniform impact, whereas at grade 2, initially, you'll remember in the previous slide, it was mid to upper range of the distribution, which was most impacted on oral reading fluency. In grade 7, it's sort of across the distribution, but actually, if anything, slightly largest at the lowest end of the distribution. And we do see a statistically significant impact on the likelihood of scoring 0 in that item. If we look at written comprehension in Setswana on the right and on the bottom, English written comprehension, which are now more advanced skills, we see the impact is dominant in the upper end of the distribution, in the top sort of 20 to 30% of the performance distribution. And so what we're thinking this may imply is that that looking at performance impacts across performance distribution, the answer is not quite as simple as the intervention was most effective for the upper or the lower end of the distribution, but rather that there may have been a somewhat uniform impact, but the impact's going to depend on what skill you're looking at it through and at what point in time. So that if you're looking at it when the intervention was first implemented, targeting foundational literacy skills, that's where you see the impact on oral reading fluency for the upper part of the distribution and letter sounds for the lower part of the distribution. But by the time you get to grade 7, oral reading fluency is now a kind of an earlier skill that is not so much where you see a difference for the stronger students. You see that difference for the lower part of the distribution, but now the better students are starting to get impacted in the more advanced skills. So thinking about these findings then, I think at a basic level, we do see some sustained impact to year 7. We see that impact on progression to grade 7, which I think with time might become a more important factor. We also see a sustained impact on literacy outcomes, both the primary targeted outcome, which was home language reading and literacy, but also in English as well. And by the time we get into grade 7, that impact is starting to be larger than it was in earlier points. We do see these various impacts across the distribution. We see an impact on 0 scores, but the different impacts are really going to depend on the skill you're looking at the point in time you're looking at it. Overall, of course, I think these results are promising for the long-term impacts of well-implemented early grade reading programs. So I think it's at least suggesting we're on the right track to make this an important focus. Other implications, we started out saying, are we going to see fade out? Or are we going to see growth in the impacts? And I think we're realizing it's not as simple as there's either fade out or growth, but it might depend on what skill you're looking at when. It might be that there's things like thresholds in certain foundational skills like oral reading and fluency, which need to be reached before you start to see benefits from interventions on higher order skills like comprehension. I think these findings in the study are starting to raise questions for future work and future studies, which might want to more explicitly focus on how are different skills building on earlier skills, and which earlier skills are maybe more strategic to target through support interventions in resource-constrained settings. For instance, I think one of the important implications of the work we've done is that targeting home language literacy skills might be really more strategic because it also leads to second language skills. We do have another experiment, which we have not reported on here, where we targeted the exact same coaching intervention on English in grades 1 to 3. And whilst we did see some immediate impact on the English outcomes, there was no positive spillover back to home language outcomes, and if anything, a slightly negative impact. So I think putting all of that together, we're starting to see which skills in the earlier grades are perhaps more important and more strategic to focus on for later learning and educational outcomes. So our plans into the future are we're going to continue to track these children. We're going to, in a few years' time, look for them in the secondary school leaving examinations. And I think then we'll get a better understanding of whether there was an impact on progression, on reaching the end of secondary school and on passing it, as well as looking at the impact on key subjects, subjects like maths, languages, and sciences, which become gateway subjects for post-school opportunities. So that's it. I think I have a minute and a half to spare, which feels like bad planning now. Sorry. Thank you.
Questions? Great. Okay, we will go ahead and dive in. We're going to use that extra minute and a half for our Q&A time. So yeah, I will take some questions from the room. Great, lots of good discussion. Okay, to save Katie running back and forth, we'll do a few from this side and then from that side. So we'll start here, here, and here, and then.
Thank you so much for very good presentations. My question is for Debbie and Kathlyn. So Debbie, you're positioning it in terms of like historical, like institutional kind of like economics of like institutions matter and the legacy of institutions. And then I see Kathlyn's work where she gives more agency to the leadership and the particular figures that's kind of like a break from the institutional literature. So how do you see this phenomena of like building commitment? So then Stefan has his work on the gambling on development, where there is an elite bargain coming together. So how does these themes fit together as we look at these issues from different lenses?
Great, thanks.
Go
ahead.
I think this is for Debbie. Thanks for excellent presentation. The purpose questions were really insightful. But the country visit, can you say more about that? I mean, I think it's currently frowned upon. The current mood is to frown upon country visits, but you seem to think it was, well, 2 years duration, breadth, length, what did they do, etc. What are your current reflections on that?
Great, and then right up front here. I think it's
Yeah. I think it's in the vein of Salman, both to Debbie and a reaction to Kat, both of them. So great work, Debbie. I think it's a push to how do we think about systems. It's not just about bureaucratic, political, and let's say programs run by NGOs, but some of the factors go deeper, historical, how the society is, all of that. I fundamentally believe a lot in it, but great to understand that about systems. But I think the other point also, in a sense, is then, what are we doing currently as programs, let's say Delhi and others? I think it's a greater question and for us to think about getting rigorous about evidence. There isn't any evidence that Delhi program is performing or the Delhi government is performing, particularly in a sense of whether they're following teaching at the right level, which everybody talked about yesterday. It almost seems like Buddhism, which started in India, but not practiced in India anymore. No government in India, state government, or the districts at that level are doing. So the question, Mesele, also is, what are we trying to measure in terms of what works or doesn't work? Is it implementation of programs? Because most programs report by themselves otherwise.
Because that was the end of a question. I heard a question mark there.
Yeah, I mean, or are we looking at how countries or states, to bring back to Rebe's question, or how countries or states or nations are improving or not improving on their system? So what are we trying to measure is the question.
Thanks for the question. And noting that those were all for our two ladies. If anyone has questions for the latter two, I would take one or two other questions for this round. Do you mind, Grady? We'll go right back there. Okay.
Hi, thanks. So my question is for Stephen. Thanks for a really great presentation. So you mentioned how early skills are really important for later skills acquisition. And so I was wondering if you can talk a little bit more, what early skills are you thinking of on top of the home language that you mentioned, and why exactly that link between home language proficiency and later second language acquisition? Thanks.
Great, thanks. Okay, we'll respond to those, and Mesele, we'll pick you up on the next round, okay? Debbie, do you want to kick us off?
Sure. So first, the question sort of about the tension between institutions mattering, building commitment, and leadership. Again, 163-page paper, monograph, we started calling it, I ended up in the presentation sort of leading a lot about the role of specific leaders. There's absolutely a key role for specific leaders, but also leadership at every level as well, in key decision making, but also in terms of including sort of teachers. Teachers unions were absolutely key to this work as well, and so not just sort of top level leaders, although that was absolutely necessary, but a variety of different levels. So I'm interested in your take on that, Kat.
Great, yeah.
I don't think
I'm so excited to read your paper and read more about the leadership element too. I think it's such a
actually first, just real quick, you also had a question about the country visits.
Yeah,
maybe before we move on.
Country visits, and then a really high level answer on sort of what are we trying to measure. Country visits, yes, absolutely. It's not sort of considered all that great anymore. It seems like there's more of exporting, sort of policy exporting countries or policy lender countries visiting the countries that they're lending to. And so I think some of it is an artifact of the time, but I also believe that the proactivity is the big takeaway from those long missions. Obviously, I don't know of a lot of countries that could spare, that believe that they could spare half of their new government for a few years. And information is available in a variety of different ways as well. Now they don't require necessarily steamships travel, although I think everybody had a really good time on that trip. But I think that the proactivity of figuring out who you want to learn from and learning from them in the way that you wish, as opposed to sort of absorbing, and I'm lacking some nuance here, but absorbing the policies that are being recommended to you and the highlights that are being recommended to you of those policies, I think is the more relevant takeaway today. And then broadly, sort of what are we trying to measure? I think that's in alignment with what that purpose is. If you have the purpose of your education system, or even as a teacher of your classroom very clearly defined, that helps shape what measures matter.
Great. So on the first question, I think that posing that as a dichotomy of like it's either institutions or it's either agency, I think we don't necessarily need to think that way. Because I think at least in the cases I saw, you really need both. And I think the kind of key punchline, I think, of this work for me was that people talk about political will and coalitions as these sort of rare, elusive things. Like, we just hope that some politicians will just suddenly decide to value education, or we hope that some sort of coalition will happen. And it's sort of this like blind faith that you're waiting for them to emerge. And I think what my research shows is you actually can take active steps as a funder or as an NGO or as a politician. Like, you can take active steps to make political will emerge, make it more likely for it to emerge, right? And I think that's where you can intentionally build institutions that make it more likely to happen, like, you know, Central Square Foundation or Lehman Foundation or Education Alliance or MPB. These are all institutions and teams that were organizations that were intentionally infrastructure for orchestration and for, you know, to implement these kinds of policies. But alongside that, though, you do just need the agency of specific people to take steps at certain times, right? And no one can really control when, you know, control the fact that Arvind Kejriwal decided as a party that education would be their issue, right? No one person influenced that. It was a much larger decision that was impacted by many factors, but the agency of those actors is very important. And we don't have change if we don't actually have actors taking certain steps at certain times. So I think it's that balance of, you know, building the institutions, kind of developing the talent and the leader pipelines, hoping that they will take agency to prioritize education and take certain steps. And then honestly, just being patient and waiting for the openings to emerge that no one has control over. And you're just going to be surprised sometimes by when the windows open or don't. So it's a combination of all of those.
Great.
Oh, sorry, the measuring, can I?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a great point that you raised, that there is not good data on the impact of the Delhi reforms. And that is the truth. And I think that's a result of a few things. I mean, I think one, when they were first starting, they were dealing with more kind of urgent things like a lot of infrastructure development, dealing with, you know, schools where the roofs were falling down or they didn't have enough desks or things like that. But also they've been moving at such a fast pace, trying to do so many reforms. And that's, I mean, I could go into like so many critiques I have of their process as well. One of which is they're trying to do dozens of things as opposed to really focusing on what are like the few reforms they can be doing that have the most impact on learning. And they would say as well, like Shailendra Sharma, who's kind of the one leading the operations of the reforms, would say the biggest problem is that they don't have a good sense of the progress that they're making and they don't have good processes for tracking data. And so I think it's a result of like the frenetic pace of what they've been trying to do and the quick change, partly also as a result of, you know, they are linked to a political party. They're trying to show voters that they are doing work so that they can then get more votes and maintain their power in Delhi and an environment where there's lots of things against them. And they're also, you know, at the same time dealing with the leader of the reforms who's in jail, lots of other, you know, challenges facing the party itself. It's kind of like in an existential threat moment. So I can understand why it has been a challenge, but obviously that is very important and it's something that they need to work on. So that's something I wonder, like people in this room, if you have thoughts on like, how can we actually support politicians who are leading these kind of reforms and who do want to be doing a better job of measuring the progress of the quality, but don't necessarily know how to do that or are facing challenges doing that? Like, how can we actually use that as an opportunity to better support governments, I think is a really interesting one. And hopefully also the What Works hub in the next phase can work on that as well.
Great, thanks. Okay, we'll come to Stephen, but Mesele, we'll circle back to you for the next round for sure. Go ahead, do you want to take the question?
Yeah, sure. Okay, so your question's about wanting to know a bit more about how and which skills lead to later skills. And I think those are the questions that our research is starting to raise now. I think Mpumi is probably the person who's best qualified to answer that amongst our co-authors. But I will say that I mean there is all this work on the science of reading, which sort of tries to understand how different components of reading work together, how different skills work together to lead to perhaps the outcome of reading with comprehension. And so perhaps we don't want to necessarily reinvent that whole science of reading. To some extent, I think what we're showing is it's worth thinking a bit more carefully about which skills you are measuring when you're doing long run follow-ups. Maybe that's a simple point to make. I think maybe, I mean, at a high level, I think we're saying so far the evidence seems to suggest focusing on home language skills rather than going straight for reading skills in a second language. And I think, again, linguistic theory is in line with that, suggesting that children learn the skills of reading best in the language that they best understand, and then are able to transfer those skills into a second language. So I think to some extent it's more empirical evidence to back up the linguistic theory. But maybe future research could try to flesh out that linguistic theory more empirically through these kinds of long-run follow-up studies and longitudinal databases that we have. And I mean, there are some debates about to what extent should we focus on more phonics-based approaches in the early grades versus more directly targeting comprehension strategies early on. And so if studies are more explicitly designed to measure those skills and the effects of programs which have a more of a focus on specific skills, I think there's some contributions to be made to help answer your questions, which we also have. Thanks.
Great, thanks. Okay, I'm going to launch one to Mesele for you to think about for when we come back to you. But one question I had from your study was you're looking at these interesting kind of longer term changes in learning outcomes and what you called teacher quality. But I don't think we got to hear a whole lot about how you were measuring those two things. So could you share a little bit more about how you were measuring the student performance? Were those the same assessments? I didn't quite catch that. Are they linked in some formal way? And then also, how were you actually measuring teacher quality? We'll come back, but you can think on that while we take a few more questions. Sure. Nick up here, right up at the top. And then
thanks so much. Super interesting presentations. But I came away with a sort of opposite conclusion from the first two presentations. And I think I'm curious to hear from both of you. So Debbie, I kind of concluded that the spark of life kind of has to come from within the country. This is like a bona fide sui generis. It's like inside the country that it's coming from. And then your presentation was saying, no, the coalitions can bring that spark if it's not there. So I'm just curious to hear from either of you, kind of, does the spark have to come from within or can it come from without? And I think that's also one of the kind of questions that's pushed into the What Works Hub. Kind of, it's why one of the things that makes it really interesting is what works, when it works, why it works, how it works. But this kind of tension between your two presentations, I'd be keen to hear your thoughts. Thanks.
My question's also for Debbie. There's lots of evidence from Africa, Latin America, a nice longitudinal study in Turkey, for example, that when societies become more educated, their values change. Like, for example, they become more individualistic. And one thing that fascinates me about Japan and Korea is that didn't seem to happen in the same extent. And even so, Geert Hofstede did this work in 50 countries and concluded that individualism and risk-taking was essential for economic growth. And then he did a study in South Korea and changed his mind, right? And so I'd love to know if you've got any insights on how they achieve that, because essentially the goal of every country, I think, is to reap the benefits of education without fundamentally changing your values. And so I read a quote from someone in Zambia once who said, "Well, we want your motor cars, but not your old people's homes," which encapsulates that idea. So I wonder if you have any insights into how that's done.
Great, thanks. Maybe one more question from this general area. Okay, we'll go right here. Okay, I'm going to stick with this side. We'll come back to this side next.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I had a question for Mesele about the, because I know in GKIP, there are lots of different interventions. So I was just wondering what else was going on with those teachers in terms of allocation of teachers to different areas or training on pedagogical support, because maybe, as an intuition, you would think that pedagogy might be more important than content knowledge for reaching the weakest learners, but you're sort of showing quite a strong role potentially for the content knowledge. So it's interesting.
Great. Okay, we'll go in reverse order to let Debbie have a little time. So Mesele, do you want to kick us off? And Stephen will come back to you next time. Okay,
Sure.
Go ahead.
Okay, thank you. I just start with the second question in terms of the intervention with the reform. Basically, the reform has several aspects in terms of intervention, but teacher training or teacher development is one of it. And in a way, it gives training to teachers as well. And then they also give some in-service training, in a sense, for those who are already teaching. So it just gives different aspects. And at the same time, the pedagogue, obviously, we just measure in terms of teacher content knowledge, but it would have been good if you can do it the pedagogical skill, obviously, but we are not able to observe them in class how they teach. We just give them a kind of test correct as a teacher. Teacher usually corrects us. We do not just ask them to sit for a test, but we ask them to correct a test which is wrongly selected or something, so that they feel like they are correct in the exams. So that is the way how we measure the teacher content knowledge, and we are not able to just undertake the pedagogical skill at the classroom. That would have been very, very good, but it's just a bit difficult task to go to the classroom and observe all these 168 schools. That's one thing. And in terms of the teacher qualification, we have here two measurements of teacher quality. One is just, as I have said, the teacher content knowledge, which has been just a paper-based test for the teachers. And the other is an index, which is a combination of 5 variables like experience, how long they have been in teaching, whether they have teaching certificate, as well as whether they specialize in maths. We are just presenting a learning outcome for maths. So whether the teacher has a specialization in maths and whether he has like a degree or a diploma level of qualification as well. So we just create an index to use a principal component analysis to make some correlation or association with the learning progress of the students.
Great, thanks. Okay, Kat, and then we'll
okay.
Debbie.
Okay, I really love this idea of the spark coming within and without. So I'm definitely going to use that, Nick. Thank you. I think that I think what's particularly interesting about both the Delhi and the Brazil cases is that they were completely indigenous, like they were completely led by people from the countries that they were working in. And I think that's interesting in contrast to, like, for example, we were talking about Nepal yesterday, and the Asian Development Bank, paid for that reform that then didn't really do anything. I think what's in contrast to this is that this was, the funders were from the country that they were working in. The teams of these funders were entirely from those countries, and all of the NGO leaders involved and politicians involved were from that country. And so I think it really was like a spark within in both cases. And I think it was just more about the speed, in a sense. Like in the India case, it was like they had that spark ignite really fast when they had the opportunity. And in Brazil, they sort of ignited it very slowly over time. That's a great metaphor. Yeah, I'm going to use that. And so I think we can think about that, then applying that to other places where, how could we enable more institutions like a Layman Foundation or a CSF to exist in other countries? And this is something I thought a lot about for Kenya. Like, how do we sort of create that equivalent of a completely local entity where those leaders have a very strong sense of all the political opportunities in the landscape of how it's changing, and are really committed to that long-term view of how do you change that country over time in a way that, development agencies and a lot of international funders just often don't have that long-term view and don't have that ongoing sense of how things are changing and what's going on. So I think we can help build those institutions that enable people who are in a country to then, create the spark or take advantage and grow that spark over time. And I think the other thing that made me think was it would be really interesting to do a study, if someone here could do a study on like where political will comes from. I feel like I haven't seen something about what actually makes politicians decide to value education and adopt reforms in terms of like the specific, these kind of moments that happen that shape their mindsets to do it. Like, I would love to know more of those stories, and that would be interesting. So like, for example, with the famous Sobral case, like, I don't know if you're aware that the politicians who started that were these brothers who were part of this very powerful political family that had been in power in Sierra for a very long time. And so they actually were able to take that risk because they kind of knew their positions were secure. And they also had this relationship with this priest who shaped their thinking on why education was important. And if you look at Pakistan, the ACER and Ali Failan campaign and the ACER study were really key in building that movement for Shahbaz Sharif and others to value education reforms. And then I also just recently was in Indonesia, where the Minister of Education, he founded Indonesia's first unicorn tech company, but before that he went to a UWC college, and that made him value education as a tool and why he wanted to move into leading innovation education. So it would be fascinating for someone to go and collect these examples and really dig more into that, because I feel like we have so much evidence about what programs need to be adopted and somewhat about like challenges in the process of implementation, but like that piece about what makes politicians and bureaucrats actually decide to mobilize and lead and have that commitment over time, because politics is often what determines whether reforms are sustained over time, I think would be interesting. So tell me if you want to work on that. I would love to follow
Thanks. Yeah, Debbie, go ahead.
And I would say that in Japan and Korea, sort of that spark came, in fact, externally, and was sort of a response to an abject fear of being colonized by the West. So to some extent, that was actually an external spark, but it really, it was internalized in a fairly specific way, and that's sort of how we see it play out. So the internal spark, sort of linking this to Matthew's question as well, there was there's a couple of answers to your question about sort of how Japan and Korea didn't end up sort of becoming westernized through this transformation, particularly when a lot of their inspiration came from Western countries. And to some extent, there's an argument that there's an influence of Confucianism. I would argue that there's influence of different reinterpretations of Confucianism, the way it influences education now versus 400 years ago when it was arguably stronger. Education levels are much higher now. But I would say also there was a big split between members of each of the policy borrowing expeditions, between sort of traditionalists and modernizers, and those who continuously iterated and pushed back on not wanting to lose their inherent Koreanness or Japanese-ness by borrowing too explicitly Western ideas. So there was a really strong desire to sort of be able to not be colonized by the West, to just meet that strength militarily, but also to do so while maintaining that identity. And that was really, really important and very explicit throughout that transformation. Yeah.
Great. Okay, we have our last minute. If someone has, I'll do the same okay, I know Barbara's had her hand up. If you can do a 30-second question and we.
That's impossible. Sorry. Kat, I have a question for you.
Okay.
Your cases of, reform champions supported by what we call policy networks are very good, but they don't explain reform reversals, which is an important phenomenon in education reform. If it was only the champions that drove the world, we'd be a lot further along in education progress. So there are stakeholders, important stakeholders that are typically threatened by education reforms, notably teachers' unions, or latent stakeholders like parents and children, students who would benefit the most, who don't really play an active role. So I'm wondering how your work is taking account of those stakeholders.
Great. A last word from Kat on that. What about regression?
Okay. Yeah, that's a really good point, Barbara. Thank you for that. So I think that two interesting examples related to that I thought a lot about. So one, I think, is Tassew in Kenya. I think is an interesting case for this because everyone holds it up as this big success story, but from talking to people in Kenya right now, the government isn't actually implementing the program anymore because of various reasons. They see it as like a US imposed initiative. Some of the funding ran out, various reasons. But I think that's an example of where I guess you called it the reform reversal happened in a sense. And so I think, I don't know what really the answer, I haven't studied that very much. So I'll put that out there, but it's something I've thought about. And what?
We'll give you our paper.
Yeah, I would love to read more about it. That would be great. But then the other, okay, sorry, I'll stop.
That's probably good.
Stop.
Why don't you guys chat more? I think there's probably a lot to unpack there. So we'll let you chat much more on that over coffee. So with that, let's give our panel a hand. Thanks, everyone.